Lucy, part 2.
So, Lucy, you are studying evolutionary biology at university. Just tell us a little bit about what you've been learning.
Well, it's a bit of a mix of everything. So this year I had 2 genetics courses. I've had a course on intracellular communication, which I really enjoyed. I did a research lab microbiology thing, and then I continued to volunteer in that lab in the second term. I took a comparative anatomy of vertebrates class, so that it wasn't quite as technical as I'd have liked it to be, but yeah, we looked at the ancestral forms and then projected ancestral forms and things like that of different vertebrate lineages.
And what's the simplest vertebrate?
The simplest vertebrate is the lamprey. It's before a fish, so it's kind of like a long tube with a circular face and keratinous rasping teeth.
And what would be the most complex or the biggest vertebrate?
Biggest vertebrate? Blue whale. I mean, Megalodon, the huge shark, was big, and there have been historically tons of very large aquatic animals, but today it's the blue whale.
What about the biggest land-dwelling vertebrate?
Today, by mass, I think the elephant.
Do all vertebrates today come from one common ancestor?
Yes.
Do they come from that lamprey?
It wouldn't. So that lamprey is basically it's undergone stabilizing selection. So basically it is as evolved as you or I are. It's just the environment that it was in favored a very specific morphology. So it's existed for as long as our lineage has, and it's been evolving that entire time, but it's been evolving to be more specifically what it is, whereas we've been evolving to be different, right? So it would have evolved, and then it's just, technically everything is a spectrum. So
in evolution, we can have one species A, and that leads to another species B, and both A and B can thrive independently, but the stepping stones in between A and B don't necessarily thrive. Is that correct?
It depends, right? So it's really easy to kind of fall into this trap of thinking of evolution as having a goal, when realistically, evolution is just the process of changes in allele frequency, which is just versions of genes over time within a population. So it's like probability, right? Except that there are factors that favor certain forms. So it's all about surviving to reproduce. So there's stabilizing, which favors the average. There's disruptive, which favors the two sides. So imagine if you have mice living on a beach, and there's white sand and then there's shade. So the mice that live on the white sand, if they're a darker color, they're easier to see. So those ones will be eaten and they won't survive to reproduce. But in the shade, the ones that are lighter will be easier to see and they'll be eaten and they won't survive to reproduce. So the ones in the middle are okay, but not very good at either. The white ones are really good for the beach, and the black ones are really good for the shade. So that would disrupt, if you started with a brown population, it would favor the two kind of extremes. And that can lead to speciation. Then we also have directional selection. So that would be for example, the pepper moths, right? So during the Industrial Revolution, all of the trees kind of became covered in smog. So the moths that were a darker color were favored. And so the entire moth population became darker.
Yeah, that's all common sense. But how do you get from molecules to man? Because in Catholic theology and Catholic philosophy, there's a principle that you can't give what you don't have. So this is called the principle of proportionate causality. The cause is always more perfect than the effect in the case of efficient causality. So how do you get from molecules to man? So
it all comes down to mutation. So in the genetic code, it basically, a new baby will have around 60 new mutations that its parents don't have.
60 out of what number?
We aren't certain because there are pseudogenes, so things that look like genes, but we don't know what they do and things.
Just give me a ballpark figure.
A couple million.
A couple million? Is it possible to have no mutations if you're really lucky?
Very unlikely. Because, I mean, it can be something as... A mutation doesn't necessarily make any difference, right? A mutation in regions of your DNA that don't code for anything, that aren't regulatory. So you can have the biggest mutation in the world in there and it won't change anything, right?
Is this what they used to call junk DNA?
Yeah. And then there's DNA that... We even have genes, they're called like fossil genes, where it used to be useful, but we've just turned them off.
Is that something like vestigial genes?
Yeah, basically, because we don't need them. Or even like you have genes that are active when you're a baby that aren't active in adulthood. So there are kind of 5 forces that drive evolution. And evolution, again, is just the change in allele frequency within a population over time. So there's natural selection, which would be like if you're a mouse and you're white and you live on a black beach, then that's not great. So you're going to be eaten and you won't have babies. Then there's sexual selection. So that's like when female deer are more likely to mate with male deer who have bigger antlers or something, which is really, that's actually really common in birds of paradise and things like that. And we see huge speciation in clades that have that. And there's mutation, which is like the source of all differences. And then we have gene flow. So it's like if you have an island of puffins and all of the puffins can interbreed freely, but then there's a volcano and then there's a huge barrier in between, or there's global warming and the middle floods or something like that. And the puffins are separated into 2 groups that can't interbreed across. That would be a disruption in gene flow, and alleles that are more common in one population won't necessarily be so common in the other, and that can change the allele frequencies. And then there is genetic drift. So that's like if you have a field of flowers and it happens to flood and kill predominantly yellow flowers, then there will be fewer yellow flowers in the next generation.
Yeah, that's all common sense, but how do you get new information into this delicate system by tampering with it randomly, with random mutations? How are you getting new and useful information into this very, very finely tuned and delicate system of information? How do you do that?
So basically, it's just a numbers game. So occasionally a mutation will cause a small change, which will be favored, or else you can have a big change that suddenly is favored. And bigger differences, more change, is caused by mutations to a regulatory region or to genes that control other genes. So instead of having a small change in the structure of a protein, you'll have a small change in how much of that protein is produced, which causes a bigger change overall. Essentially, species are just a way of classifying, right? So, and this is actually, if you're looking at, say, human evolution, one of the really big debates is at what point are we human, right? Because there's this huge, huge line of primates, and a primate would include anything from a lemur to a chimpanzee, right? So New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, all of the great apes, lesser apes, everything.
What's our closest ancestor, according to evolution?
Kind of closest behind us is Homo erectus.
Are there any of them walking around today?
No, not anymore. Homo neanderthalensis is kind of like a cousin of ours.
And are they walking around today?
No. As kind of the evolutionary lineage branches, everything is evolving, right?
Yeah, but we still have bacteria today, and according to evolution, we evolved from bacteria, no?
Oh, yes.
So we do have our direct ancestors. That original bacteria that we evolved from, is it extinct?
We're not certain about what the original one, but yes, like it's consider like your grandparents are dead, so you don't have direct ancestors, but you do have cousins, right? So with the bacteria, we don't have fossils past a certain point. Genetics, we can see common genes between us and bacteria. With humans, we have fossil evidence. We have, in some cases, we have DNA, even from the physical evidence.
So evolution is making a claim about origins based on patterns that it sees in the fossil record and in DNA, right? But I think it's fair to say that there might be other explanations, and that there could even be better explanations using different ways of interpreting the data. No?
it's not that I believe in evolution. It's that looking at all of the evidence, it's the only explanation that all of the evidence supports.
It's coherent. It's coherent. Yeah, it's a coherent story, but it's just a story. That's my point. I think you have to admit there are other ways of looking at the data, looking at the facts, and there isn't necessarily a causal relationship between the simpler but similar patterns that we're lining up in this so-called tree of life. We've never seen one kind of animal turning into another kind of animal. We've never seen it.
What about dinosaurs and birds?
Have you seen that?
Do you mean watching with your own eyes? Because we have examples of that too. I read about an experiment where they took a singular-celled organism and they grew it in this tank for probably thousands of generations, right? It was a several-year experiment. Then they introduced a predator, and within a number of generations, the single-celled organism that was the prey had evolved to be 11 cells, and within another few generations, it had gone back down to 7 or 8 because that was more advantageous.
I'm not impressed by that. If single-cell organisms want to cluster together, I don't see that as a change in kind. If you want to show me a dog turning into a non-dog or a rat turning into a non-rat, that would be impressive, but there are no examples of that. So you mentioned 3 types of selection, 3 types of evolution. Are they all equally active today?
Yes. For example, there would have been disruptive selection to have multiple skin tones. And then, say, Nordic people, it's advantageous to have lighter skin so you can have vitamin D. And so there would have been stabilizing selection once there was lighter skin. Or you can even, directional selection to have lighter skin and then stabilizing selection on that skin tone, right? So that's just a way of talking about what is happening to the individual traits. But there are tons and tons of ways to talk about evolution. Another one would be punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. So gradualism would be over a very, very, very long time, giraffes evolved to have longer necks, right? Each generation having slightly longer because the ones who had longer necks were more successful. Punctuated equilibrium basically means that it's the same for a very long time, and then suddenly there's a mutation that's very advantageous, and so it is selected for. So imagining maybe the lampreys, if there was a change in their environment where a predator came in and would eat any lampreys that were pink, then there would be suddenly a strong selection on any color that could survive, right? So what we found is that a lot of the intermediate fish tetrapod in between there, we call them fishopods, or we call them, it's between a fish and an amphibian, basically. So coelacanths are the closest living fish relatives to tetrapods, and if you look at their fins, as opposed to having a very narrow fin that just has the bones and then the skin on them, it has a very muscular fin, which is, you don't see that in other fish. So we see that the fins become more muscular, and then they're paired and they're able to support the fish. And we see lungfish that are able to prop themselves up. We see fish that are able to even walk on land from pond to pond today. And then we see that the eyes migrate to the top of the head, which means that they were very likely looking out above the water. So we see the eyes come to the top of the head. They have more limb-like fins. And then we start to see necks.
So one of these fish was actually born with a neck? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Evolution works so slowly. It can work very quickly, but on this scale, going from fish to amphibians, it's not like the next generation has the next thing, right?
So what you're saying is the advantage you have over your parents is a negligible advantage. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily. Your parents are more fit than their peers.
Okay, peers. So what you're saying is that those that survive are negligibly more fit than their peers, and that's why they survive, because they're negligibly more fit.
Yes, and there's absolutely there are random events as well, like if you talk about the British Shale, but it's descent with modification, so they're tiny changes. There are tiny changes in fitness, and those affect who survives. But it happens on such a large scale. It happens over such a long time period that negligible changes do matter.
But negligible improvements are negligible, right? That means we can neglect them. They're insignificant.
Insignificant, but the thing is, it has to be big enough to make that difference, right? If you're conserving energy, if you have better access to food, if you have better access to mates, you can't neglect it. It's small considering, but it
takes millions of years for these negligible improvements to accumulate, right? And to become significant. Or maybe it's not a slow change. Maybe one of the babies is born with a slightly flexible neck. Is that what you're saying?
If there's a change in a regulatory sequence, you could end up with an extra neck bone, right? So that's quite a big difference, right? Or there are metabolic differences as well. You can look at any factor of an animal's niche is a factor in its fitness, right? So even if it's better at finding places to hide, that could be selected for. So
allegedly, non-flying creatures evolved into flying creatures with feathers and wings, right?
Okay. Dinosaurs, we think that feathers evolved as like part of a thermoregulation system, and it could be pseudomorphism where like hatchlings would have feathers to keep them warm while they have a small body size, and then they would be lost later, and then eventually it became advantageous for that. It's a change in life history, so the feathers would not be lost. They keep that juvenile state.
So the feathers were there to begin with. So this is not very impressive. We already have the feathers. So let's talk about that transition from non-feathers to feathers. Let's talk about that.
I won't pretend to understand how exactly feathers arose, but so it could have been some kind of integument, right? So it could have been a specialized scale or something like that. But there's a mutation that allows, let's say, a scale to specialize into being elongated. This might provide more warmth because it protects the skin. And for an animal that can't, it's an ectotherm, right? It relies on its external environment to maintain its body heat. That allows it to have a little bit more control. So then it doesn't freeze to death. Or it could be something as random as like, it has no effect. And so that one mates with, and like equally with other ones.
They have the same random mutation?
Not even. Like it could be, you have brown eyes, that has no effect on your fitness, let's say. That means that you could have kids equally as someone with green eyes or blue eyes. It has no effect, so it doesn't matter. Then you're passing on your genes, even though there's no effect. They're not advantageous. They're not being selected for. They're just not being selected against. So it spread in the population because it had no negative effect and it had no positive effect. And eventually people have it, right? It's kind of immaterial. So this could happen, the mutation could spread, and then another mutation arises that allows these elongated scales to have barbs on them. And let's say that one is selected for because it can help to regulate body temperature. That one, like, we'll call them reptiles because that's probably what they were. That reptile can be a little bit more successful because maybe it's a cold winter and it can resist that, right? Eventually that spreads and more of the population has it, and then maybe a mutation arises that the feathers are flashier and that's sexually selected for, and so it becomes like, and then it can speciate and things like that. So if you argue that the potential for something is there, it goes back so far, right? Because if a feather evolved from a scale, any kind of integument has the potential to be a scale, and then it goes back to what, like the plasma membrane. But I would see that as an argument for evolution because it's just a small mutation in existing DNA, right? Then we can definitely see a change from something more like a filament, almost analogous to fur, just as a kind of warm layer. We see a change from that to the bladed feathers that we see on birds, right? That could be good for flight. And actually, we even have a name for genes that are duplicated and can then be repurposed. Paralogous genes is when you get an extra copy of the gene, and then the first gene copy can control the original function, and the second gene copy is free to
explore.
Exactly, yeah. As mutations arise, it is not necessarily selected against because it's not impeding that original function. And so mutations can kind of add up and the function can change.
So we've looked at the past through the lens of evolution. Now let's turn and look toward the future, because we are far more evolved than a fish, for example, and we cultivate fish as pets, as food, and it's possible that there's a race of beings that are evolved far beyond us, and maybe they live out in outer space, and if they come back and they want to cultivate us as pets and use our flesh as food. So what would you say to this super evolved creature that came back and wanted to take you as a pet or to eat you as food? What would you say to them?
I mean, personally, I may not enjoy being a pet, but I think absolutely evolution is still happening. Absolutely. There is a future of life. We think that our solar system is only about halfway through its lifespan. So, and everything that's happened, there's no way that we're finished, right? The thing about evolution and the thing about science like this is that there is no good or bad. It's random, right? But
don't you see that it's absolutely wrong for humans to be taken as pets or to be used for food?
I don't think that we are somehow the chosen ones. Viruses kill people. Bacteria kill people. Like, does that mean the bacteria are king of us?
It's not evil when they do it because they don't have free will and reason, but we do. That's why this is the whole essence of what it is to be human, is to have free will and reason.
I don't believe that it would be wrong for them to come and eat us. Like, I wouldn't personally like it, but I mean, the gazelle doesn't like to be eaten by the lion, right?
Even if they're 1,000,000 times more advanced than we are, it's categorically wrong for them to enslave us, to take us as pets, or to use us as food. Don't you see that?
The thing about evolution that we have to remember is that anything that survives, tons of things don't. We've had so many mass extinctions, right?
So death is our friend in evolution.
Yeah.
So just to end the interview, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you're excited about moving forward with your career in biology.
Well, I'm really excited about learning about the human microbiome because our bodies cannot digest a lot of the foods that we eat. And we rely on the bacteria that live in us and on us to protect us from infection and then to help us digest our food. They train our immune system. They help with angiogenesis, the production of red blood cells. We have it's called dysbiosis. If you say take antibiotics and it kills the bacteria in your stomach or in your large intestine, technically, it can have huge effects on your health, right? And that's really, really strong coevolution because a lot of the foods that we make use of, we wouldn't be able to eat if it weren't for those bacteria, right? It's the same thing as if you think of cows. They would not be able to eat grass and digest it and get the nutrients that they need from it if they weren't ruminants, if they didn't have those 4 stomachs and the bacteria associated with them. So as we research that and as we learn more about that, we are understanding the link between the human microbiome and all sorts of diseases, especially modern things like allergies, even depression and anxiety, autism, and then obvious ones, leaky gut syndrome, all sorts of like autoimmune diseases, lupus, multiple sclerosis, tons and tons of different disorders. So I'm really excited to learn about how an understanding of that gut microbiome and the makeup of the human microbiome can help us to come up with really tailored practices, treatments, and then antibiotic resistance is a huge problem and it's only going to get worse. So coming up with a solution, another way of killing bacteria so that we don't get infections, hopefully that they can't resist. Actually, one of the ones that I'm really excited about is phage therapy. So that refers to bacteriophages or viruses that attack bacteria. And one of the advantages is that these viruses are highly specific. So they would kill the exact strain of bacteria that they are specialized to. So if you had an infection, they could kill only those bacteria, and your natural microbiome wouldn't be killed as it would be with antibiotics. Problems with this, one of the kind of the most serious problem, ignoring the difficulties that we have in actually making it happen, is that they can pick up, these viruses can pick up pathogenicity islands, so DNA like factors that allow bacteria to be virulent, and they can transfer them to non-virulent bacteria and make them dangerous. It would be really exciting if I could be involved in that process, and if not, it'll be exciting to just hear about what's going on with that. Sorry.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you've got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.